Okay, so for this video, we will be talking about the analysis of financial statements. So in this discussion, we will only focus on the financial ratios. Okay, so you will learn about the different ratios being used to assess the financial status of a certain company. Okay, based on the figures that is being presented in their financial statements. So for this module, we have two learning outcomes. So you students should be able to determine or define the different ratios as well as their importance in our analysis of the financial statements and as well as familiarize with those formulas, okay, in the ratios that we will be discussing. So here, the ratios normally is one of the tool that is being used for the analysis of financial statements. So aside from the ratios, we can also use the horizontal and vertical analysis. Okay, that is being used also, especially if you will compare our performance or the performance of one entity with that of the other competitors in the same industry. Okay, but for this module, again, we will only focus on financial ratios. Okay, so basically, when we say financial statement analysis, so here, it normally involves selection of the data that is being presented in the FS. Okay, so the purpose of this, of course, is to assess and evaluate the firm's past performance. Okay, because we all know that the data being presented in our financial statements are based on historical data, meaning to say these are uh, financial transactions or economic activities that have been transpired in the past and been recorded. That's why it's called as historical data. So based on this, we can assess, okay, the performance of the entity. So we can also assess or evaluate the present condition. Okay, so normally if we are using the current financial statement, so we will know what is the current condition of in terms of financial aspects of the entity. And this data also, the result of the analysis can also be used for future potentials or future plans, okay, of the entity. Okay, so based on the past performance. Okay, so these are the uses or the importance of the financial statement analysis. Okay, so that's why most of the economic entities or enterprise should normally perform this FS analysis. Okay, so here for the first uh, type of ratios. Okay, by the way, we have the different classification of ratios. Okay, so the first types of ratio under the financial statement analysis that we use is or are the liquidity ratios. Okay, so here, if we will uh, use these liquidity ratios, the result of the analysis will provide us with information about the firm's ability to pay its current obligations. Okay, and we can also assess if they are able to continue their operations, okay, in the short or long run. Okay, by the way, when we say liquidity, this refers to the cash or the availability of other resources or current assets that can be uh, made as a payment for the current obligations of the entity. So current assets, normally this constitute the operating or working capital. So meaning to say these are the assets that are normally used, converted, for example, for non-cash assets, they can be converted into cash within 1 year or 12 months, or within the normal operating cycle of the entity, whichever is uh, longer. Okay, so the purpose of this, or the main idea of this is that these assets are currently moving, is being used currently, or in the present, or for 1 year, or for 12 months, or for the normal course of operations or operating cycle of the entity. Okay, so depending on the entity on how they classify their assets, okay, so we will know based on their presentation, okay, that we can see in their financial statements. Okay, so we can also identify what are the current assets, okay, and the non-current assets. But in this case, if we will use the liquidity ratios, we will focus more on the current assets. Okay, if these current assets are able to pay for the current obligations also of the entity. Okay, meaning to say, when we say current obligations or current liabilities, these are liabilities that also uh, are due within 12 months after the balance sheet date, okay, or the normal operating cycle of the entity. Okay, so that's uh, the, the idea, okay, for selecting the data to be taken from the financial statements when using the liquidity ratios. Okay, so here we will examine the composition, except for cash. Okay, so all other items are still to be converted into cash, as mentioned, if that is non-cash current assets. Okay, if they are available for payments as well. Okay, so liabilities, normally this is payable in cash. Okay, so there are also liabilities that can be paid with items of non-cash assets, but normally, uh, most commonly, we use cash as a payment for the liabilities. Okay, so we have here the example, like American shoe manufacturer cannot pay with shoes for the leather that they bought on credit. So this should be paid in cash. Okay, this is an example of a liability that should be made or paid in cash and not in other form of non-cash assets. Okay, so this is what we are emphasizing. So for the liquidity ratios, okay, so we have two ratios under this analysis. So the first that we have is what we call the current ratio. Okay, so when we say current ratio, this ratio will measure the ability of the business to pay its short-term obligations if they fall due. Okay, so this is actually the main idea of liquidity ratios. We will determine based on the result if the entity is able to pay their short-term liability. Okay, so the formula for current ratio is current assets divided by current liabilities. So meaning to say, in this case, okay, for example, if our total current liabilities, okay, is 100, let us put a figure, okay, in this uh, formula. While our total current liabilities is 50. Okay, so if we will divide this, therefore our current ratio will be equal to 2. Okay, so what does this means? Okay, this means that, okay, based on the figures that is being presented, uh, if your current liability is larger or higher than your current if your current assets is larger or higher than your current liabilities, just like in our example, then meaning to say the company is able to pay for their current liabilities because there is greater assets that can be paid, okay, for the liabilities. But of course here, we should exclude the cash figure, okay, or just like what we have mentioned earlier, okay, or depending on the analysis, okay. So uh, sometimes, okay, but normally current ratio, okay, we I mean cash, I mean, is also part of the current assets, by the way. Okay, so basically the cash item is not included if we are preparing for cash flow. Okay, so but here we will use the total current assets. Okay, please take note of that. Okay, so again, in this example, our current assets is greater than our current liabilities. So meaning to say, the entity is able to pay for their short-term liabilities if it falls due. So here, the two uh, current ratio means that uh, there is a greater chance that the entity can pay their liabilities, short-term liabilities. This is a good indication, okay, in terms of liquidity. Okay, so meaning to say the company can pay two times, okay, more than their liabilities. That is what it means, okay, under this ratio. They are able to pay two times more than their current liabilities. So this is a good indication. Okay, but what about if, for example, the current asset is only 50, okay, while our current liabilities is 100. Okay, so the answer for this is, okay, 0.5, correct? Okay, so what does this indicate? Okay, in this example right here. So in this case, uh, this indicates that the company cannot actually pay their liabilities. They can own, I mean, they can pay their liabilities, but it's only up to 50%. Okay, so this is not a good indication because your current assets are less than your current liabilities. Okay, so the objective of this is to have at least one current ratio, of one, meaning for every, okay, for example, if you will change this one, okay, this is the ideal. If you will change that to 100, so the answer would be your current ratio is 1. Meaning to say, so this is the correct presentation actually. 1 is to 1 because we are talking about ratio. Okay, for every 1 peso of liability, okay, the entity can also pay 1 peso. Okay, but if we will go back with our first illustration, so for every 1 liability, okay, there is 2 current assets that can be paid. So this is a much better ratio. Okay, so this is our optimum or ideal ratio, 1 or more than 1. Okay, so that is for current ratio. So the next ratio under liquidity ratios is what we call quick ratio. Okay, so for the quick ratio, this measures also the immediate liquidity with the ability to pay the current liabilities with the most liquid assets. Okay, basically, when we compare the uh, current ratio and quick ratio, they are just the same. However, the difference of this is that we do not include the non-cash current assets that are that takes longer to convert into cash, like our inventory and prepaid expenses. So they are considered to be least liquid among the current assets. So again, under the current ratio, we only include for our current assets the most liquid assets. When we say most liquid assets, these are readily convertible into cash anytime. Okay, so that's why for the uh, formula, so for our numerator, instead of using the total current assets, we will only be using the cash item, short-term investments, so we can convert this in a very short period of time into cash. That's why it's included, as well as our trade receivables. However, in terms of inventories, prepaid expenses, and other non-cash current assets that are that takes longer to be converted into cash, so we exclude them from our analysis. Okay, so please take note of the numerator. So this is the only thing that differs from that of the current ratio. Okay, so our denominator is still current liabilities. So again, just like in our current ratio, the analysis there is that we should at least have one or more quick ratio that will indicate that the entity is able to pay with their current liabilities when it falls due. Okay, again, the only difference is the formula or the numerator. Okay, so that's all under the liquidity ratios.